we have kind of come to the part in our vague movement through Mark. We've come to the part that we've called in the title of the notes, Journey to Jerusalem, Moving Toward the Cross. And I think it's really important, if we were preaching Mark as a whole, to make sure people feel the force of this section in terms of how Mark works, but also in terms of how the gospel works. You know, I think we need to recognize that it's so easy to assume that people are with us. And I don't just mean Christians, you know, rather than non-Christians. Hopefully we're aware that non-Christians could always be present, and therefore we always need to communicate. And actually, even if there are no non-Christians present, if you're preaching in church, preach as if there are non-Christians present, because otherwise your people won't feel like it's safe to bring their neighbor, their colleague, their friend. Now you might think, I've got every intention. If I spot a non-Christian, I'm going to give them the gospel in a really beautiful, clear, winsome way. And you look around, you think, this is the normal people. Give the gospel in a clear and winsome way as if there's somebody there that doesn't know Jesus, and do it for years if you have to. Because eventually there'll be people in your church that think, my neighbor's asking questions and is interested and is willing to come to church, and I'm actually going to encourage it because I trust the church. I think that's something a lot of church leaders don't think about. We tell people, bring your friends, bring your neighbors. And some of them are thinking, I wouldn't bring an enemy into this environment. Like I'm scared of how awkward they're going to feel. You know, and I've spent 20 years trying to build a relationship with my neighbor, and if I bring them to church and they feel awkward, and then they feel got at, and then they feel it's irrelevant, I've lost the opportunity. I might even lose the friendship. And so we've got to win the trust of our people for them to be bringing their connections into a church or a church-related environment. So in that sense, I mean, that's an aside, but that's important. Preach as if there are non-Christians present always in church. And actually, even in a conference. You know, if there was an evangelical Christian leaders event back in the day, John Wesley would have been there, but he might have been there before he was a Christian. You know, there's people that are very sort of advanced in church world that haven't yet realized that actually it's for them, or actually they're not in. You see what I mean? So the whole idea of there's an environment where we don't need to offer the gospel. But then even when you get to, okay, here are a group of Christians, they still need the gospel. We've got to get away from the idea that the gospel is for non-Christians and Christians need some feeding, some instruction. You know, I sort of grew up in that rhythm. Sunday evening, gospel service. Every single week, it was just a sort of invitational gospel thing, which is fine, but a little bit laborious at times, because it was always the same thing, using different passages. Rather than preaching the passages, and, you know, it kind of got frustrating at times, but, you know, abuse a passage in order to say the gospel bit, and when you say the gospel bit, everyone goes, that's good. A bit confused. And then on a Tuesday night, for believers studying the tabernacle and, you know, into sort of the heavy stuff with no relevance to life communicated, the Bible's relevant, but the preaching wasn't. You know what I'm saying? So it's like this separation. If you're not a Christian, gospel presentation. If you're a Christian, heavy Bible information. And I think, hang on a second. How about both? Like, heavy Bible information doesn't need to come in, but how about we communicate to everybody when we communicate? So offer the gospel always in the sense of an evangelistic, invitational type of ministry, but also recognize that Christians, young and old, need to be reminded of the gospel. You know, not because they need to become Christians again, but because that is how we grow. It's by faith from first to last. You know, think of that start of Galatians. Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified, and yet now you think You've moved beyond that. You think that by flesh you are going to be perfected, by your own efforts. And Galatians is a real punch in the nose to a lot of church practice, where we think gospel saves, and then pressure and discipline and duty is how we grow. I think Paul is pretty clear. It's by faith from first to last. It's a response to the one who loved us and gave himself to us. Not just how we get in, but how we grow up. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And so when I say preaching the gospel, I mean preaching, because it needs to be invitational, responsive. And the thing to remember or try to keep in mind is, even somebody who's been a Christian for, 2.5 centuries, you might have those in your church, even if somebody's been a Christian for a very long time, they're still affected by what I call fallen world gravity. Okay, so, or sort of spiritual gravity. You know what physical gravity is? Whether you understand it or not, it's consistently working. If you were to get a key to one of these little window deals and open it and jump through it thinking it's okay, I don't believe in gravity, the people in the lobby would have an experience, because gravity's true whether you believe it or not. And spiritual gravity in this fallen world is true whether you're Christian or not. Right? Obviously, once I say it, that just because you're a Christian, that doesn't mean you're now floating and spiritually on a high and never tempted. Right? You're never drawn away. You're never turned back to yourself. Of course you are. We have that, wretched man that I am kind of tension in this life, right? And hopefully we can, learn and grow, and sanctification can develop us and so on, but we're never fully free of it while we're still in the flesh, right? So spiritual gravity is pulling us. And where does it pull us? It's not just pulling us to Las Vegas, sort of the traditional, obvious type of grotesque sin. It could be that. But it's always pulling us. It could be pulling us toward being an older brother. Self-righteous, self-sufficient, self-trusting, self-loving. Because that's the core issue in the fall, isn't it? That we curved in on ourselves. And so you can be following Jesus, loving Jesus, preaching Jesus in ministry, and you're never fully free of this tendency to go, oh, I love me. And that I love me can show itself like a younger brother or an older brother, but the core issue is that I love me. You see, that's what's pulling on us. Therefore, here's the point I was trying to make 5 minutes ago. Therefore, when you preach, don't assume that everybody is fully clear on things like Jesus went to the cross on purpose. The cross was no accident. It was God's plan. You might think, well, I've heard that, I've thought about that, I've written essays on that, I'm crystal clear on that. Almost guarantee if you've got 20 or 30 people in your church, there's somebody there that's thinking, it's such a shame that he died. Such a lovely guy. You know what I mean? Like, we had this woman in our church, she came for 2-3 years, something like that, and really gracious, and I'm almost tempted to say really Christian-like, you know what I mean? Like really nice, sort of person that you think, well, it's probably a Christian, because it's like fruit of the Spirit is, at a superficial level, whatever. And my wife was connecting with her, sharing Bible verses with her, and, and over time my wife said, she's not a Christian. She's not, I'm really concerned for her. And so she shared the gospel with her and shared the gospel with her. And this woman's perspective was so warm to Jesus, but she just could not see certain things, just blind to certain truths. And the cross was just really troubling for her. So bad. And Melanie's saying, right, but for Christians it's so beautiful. It's the ultimate revelation of the nature and character of God. Yeah, it's so bad. And you go, well, yeah, it is horrible, but if you don't see the beauty of it, maybe you haven't been awakened spiritually to know what's actually going on there. You know what I mean? There's a both and, isn't there, for us as Christians? The cross should make us sick to our stomachs, if we really think about it, but it should also make us fall on our faces in worship. And so it's that spiritual eyes to see. And so you can be preaching through the gospel thinking, oh, this is wonderful. I'm preaching through the gospel of Mark, and I'm pointing to the gospel of Jesus Christ all the way through. And you could have people that are missing what you're saying all the way through. And so there's no harm in being as clear as possible that the cross was the goal, that this was deliberate. And therefore, this section is critical to achieving that. In fact, this section is doing that in the gospel itself. Remember what we said day one? I don't know if this was repeated yesterday, but the idea of miracles and healing and don't tell anyone. Why was the secret there? Because once they recognized, once Peter declared, you are the Christ, okay, hang on, I'm not going to let you have that insight without the cross. You cannot have Christ without the cross. All right, you lose the message if you think the Messiah is just a healer, because the cross is critical. And so that turning point there, chapter 8:30, kind of right in the middle there, after the double-blind miracle, that's the hinge. And from that point on, what we're reading in 8, 9, 10, which gets us to the gates of Jerusalem, if you like, this 3-chapter section has a really coherent and powerful message. One more preaching comment. As you're preaching through a book, as a preacher, you should be able to study to the point where you can see how the book is working. Most people that are listening don't think in those ways. Generally, I think people tend to be either detail-oriented or big picture, right? So as preachers, some preachers are so detail-oriented that they love explaining the complexities of a word or a verse, but they just don't think in terms of how it flows or how it fits. And certainly listeners can be very what's in front of me and not see the big picture. And whatever way you lean, if you're detailed or if you're big picture, you need to be able to do both. Because it would be such a shame to go through Mark, whether it's over 10 weeks or 10 years, if you're that way inclined, however long you take to go through it, it would be a shame if it just felt like, oh, here's an interesting story. Oh, here's an interesting story. Oh, here's an interesting story. Because in between the stories, people go to work multiple times, sleep multiple times, eat 3 times more than that at least, and exercise and have family troubles and maybe a round of golf and watch 2 football matches and whatever. Like, life happens, and for us as preachers, we're thinking, oh, last week I said this, oh, this is great. For them, they're thinking, I don't remember last week. Or what series are we in again? And it's just like dropping in, right? And so help people to see how a book works, and people will start to fall in love with books, not just with favorite verses or favorite stories. Does that make sense? So what I want us to do is we're going to think about this section 8, 9, 10, and I want us to do a little bit of work in groups first, and then we'll come back and kind of share the wealth. So you're looking for the prediction. There's going to be a prediction of the cross, of the passion. Look at it, see what you notice in it. The disciples' response, and then Jesus' response to their response. It's nice and simple, okay? I'm going to the cross. We're talking about this. So it's prediction of the cross, disciples' response, Jesus answering them or teaching them. And technically, that would cover the entire 3 chapters. We could literally flow through, but it would take too long to do massive chunks. And so I'm going to narrow it slightly so that you've got something of all of that. You'll have the full prediction, and you'll have their response, but Jesus' teaching, in a couple of cases, goes further. What we're looking at here is kind of the establishing of the rhythm. I've already told you the rhythm, but this is establishing something. It continues on because we're not jumping into the next one until 9:30, so we've got quite a chunk. Within that, there's the transfiguration. not minor. That's a significant thing. And I wonder, in terms of the placement, just a superficial comment perhaps, but Jesus has just revealed something really significant. And then the transfiguration is like a really significant endorsement of listening to him from the Father. And then there's a reaffirmation that they're quite hard in their hearts in the stories that follow that. And so I think Mark wants the reader to know, wow, but they're not getting it. All right? And that, if we had longer, we could have taken that whole section. And the danger is that you see this as a prediction in isolation, but actually seeing the prediction and the follow-up right the way through to this one helps to see how Mark is working. Two thoughts, just since this is a preaching network, I can't help myself. But when you're preaching through a section like this, thinking about its place in the gospel, it's easy to sort of have lost some steam, some momentum. When you starting a series is not hard. Everyone's excited or pretending to be, So launching something new, and I think it's a good idea to make a thing of that. Why not? We have Christmas, we have Easter. Why not have a new series? Let's try to motivate people into their Bibles. But you can kind of start and enjoy, and this is great. This is getting long now. When are we going to get to Jerusalem? And so 8, 9, 10 could be a place where people are starting to feel like, we're losing momentum, even if it's a relatively short series, because you know where you're going. And so if you can help people to see this is really unique, this section is doing something specific, not just a further accumulation of more stories. And do you know what I mean? It's what we're seeing even in these kind of 3 presentations. If that can be communicated to your church, that can really help them kind of be lifted within the series. And one other comment. With narrative, which is what we're dealing with, one of the ways narrative works, narrative in its most essential, basic description is characters in a plot. All right, that's as basic as I can make it, 4 words. All right, characters in a plot. And obviously, obviously, in the Gospels, the character you want people to be looking at is Jesus. Right? So he's the focus, he's the hero of the story, if you want to think in narrative terms, but he's, the protagonist, so he's really the focus. But the way narratives work is that people identify with characters. And there's an incredible potential to identify with the disciples in this. And one of the things we can do as preachers is be so disparaging of the disciples that everybody in the room looks down on the disciples because they were stupid. And that's a missed opportunity. As a preacher, to help people see the tension the disciples are feeling reflects the tension we can be feeling. Different story, but just to kind of make my point slightly, we preached through the Abraham narrative in our church last summer, I think. And even just the simple thought of how many years pass as Abraham is still struggling to come to terms with what God has told him. I noticed several times when we mentioned, you may be struggling to come to terms with what God is showing you, and you may be feeling like I should know this by now. We've just seen 25 years pass. We've just seen 35 years. It's just seeing that. And, as a preacher, you can tell when it resonates. There was a lot of people in the room that were like, wow, I needed that. And I think with the disciples, it's so easy to make them clowns, especially in these 2 bits. Oh my word, if only we were there. Actually, if only we were there, we would have been just like them. And if you can help people to connect with characters in a narrative, it's like it goes from words on a page to a movie in the heart. And people cry at movies. People, change their politics at movies. There's a power in a screen presentation. And I think as preachers of narrative, we have the opportunity to, project the movie, but always driven by the text. Does that make sense? And so, learning the skill of effective storytelling, helping people to imagine it, taking your time as you work through a section and not just skimming past it and then making theological points, but allowing the image to form. You'll find people start to connect with the disciples as a group or Peter as an individual. And that's where I was going to say the magic happens, that's the wrong phrase. That's where, the connection happens so that they start to be in Peter's sandals, hearing the rebuke of Jesus or, feeling the tension between them and missing the point. And actually, that's exactly what we as followers of Jesus, are. So the section after this, again, from after 37 down to 1032, but there's sort of the radical nature of being a disciple. But there's also a lot of teaching about divorce and children. And you think, well, hang on, that must be an aside. Actually, I think it fits. If Jesus is going to be preaching to be a follower is a really radical thing, I don't mean leave your wife. You see that sort of connection, that being a follower of Jesus is take up your cross and follow. It's, be as humble as a child, but live it in your context. I think keeping that together, otherwise you could lose the flow between this chart and this one. And I believe the first reference to the cross is 834. So there's some new content coming here, and there's a progression within the development. So what is it to be a disciple? What does it mean to follow Jesus? It means taking up our cross and following him. So the cross-shaped following of Jesus. So you got the cross thing here. And this one, there's kind of the social hierarchy inversion. To be a follower of Jesus is not about, up here. It turns everything upside down while not taking you out of your family. But so there's that thing. And then here, okay, what does that look like to be carrying your cross, to have everything turned upside down? It looks like being willing to serve, not to be served. So he really emphasizes that it's not about climbing the pyramid. So that piece at the end there about, how the Gentiles lord it over. Not so with you. It's different. You're supposed to be serving. I came not to be served, but to serve. And, so there's that radical difference. And the teaching through this section, if you took these 3 chapters out of Mark would be so impoverished. You'd be kind of, we wouldn't, but in theory, we'd be saying, hang on, something's missing. Obviously, you don't criticize the Bible because God inspired it. But you know what I'm saying? This is so significant.